Live streaming is on.
Is this actually working? There we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to an overdue new episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Yep, it's working. Okay, excellent. Just bear with me while I get things set up, and we'll be going. It's not going to be a super long episode tonight, and I'll get into why once I'm set up. But we are going to have an episode. There we go. Okay, that's all working. And just bear with me, it won't take long. Boom, boom. And let's do the boom and the boom and the boom, boom, boom. Boom. And one more. Boom. Okay, those are all where they should be. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's episode. I know it's been quite a while, but while my medical issues are ongoing, if anything, I have more of them. I miss making videos, so I decided I'm going to come back, do a subject I meant to cover a while ago when this situation was still going on. But I'm going to cover it now. I'm going to talk about what happened, and I'm going to talk about the implications of what happened. But let me get some housekeeping out of the way first. We're back. I plan to do episodes weekly again, but once again, I got a bunch of things in the works at the moment. I've got a case coming up, things of that nature. But we are going to start getting episodes out to you again. As you can see, I even have a snazzy new set of headphones. I'm looking forward to it. I've missed you guys. I've missed doing this. I can't guarantee how often it'll be or how long it'll be. I'm going to try to keep it at the hour, but that's going to depend on all the various fun things I've got going on right now. But that said, I wanted to specifically address the situation that happened a couple of weeks ago with a YouTuber that goes by the name of Telltale. Telltale is not someone I know personally, although he's somebody whose videos I've enjoyed. He does a lot of videos about cults. Particularly, he was a former Jehovah's Witness. He's done a number of videos about them, about what they actually believe, about some of the shady dealings going on. He's been whenever I've talked, in fact, about Jehovah's Witnesses, about cults, and about the Steve and Spite model, his videos have been a major resource for me. That said, he has a daughter, Alpha 40, I think his name. She usually is used in videos. Kylie is her actual name, I believe. 12 years old. They were living in West Virginia. Now, Kylie's health teacher was in a public high school, mind you, was preaching, or proselytizing, in other words, preaching on the job. Specifically saying about how homosexuals are bad people, how it's wrong and immoral to have sex before marriage. But hopefully all of the kids were raised by good parents and who taught them proper moral values. The kicker here is, and if you go to Telltale's channel, he even has recorded, because Kylie, to her credit, and I have a lot of respect for this 12-year-old that she was willing to do this, she actually recorded the teacher saying these things. This is not a he said, she said. This happened. The problem is, it's a violation of the First Amendment. Big time. Even the teacher admits it in the video, in the audio, I should say. You can hear her saying that she knows that this is wrong. And let's be honest, if she did this in a northern state instead of down in the Bible Belt, like West Virginia, she'd have lost her job right off the bat. I don't know what's happened with the teacher, but I do know. I hope that she was disciplined properly, because again, I know at the very least, I believe she was suspended. But the far worst part of this, as bad and terrible as what the teacher did was, and it was, what came next is so much worse. Because the recording went public. Telltale was quickly doxxed. His 12-year-old daughter was doxxed. People made threats. There was a Facebook group that I have plenty of issues with Facebook, but to their credit, they quickly took down. But the Facebook group was specifically about doxing Telltale, revealing where his house was, people planning on driving by, people did in fact drive by, people making threats. And the fact that they threatened Telltale is unacceptable by itself. There is no defense for that. Because what the teacher did is wrong and illegal. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But they threatened a 12-year-old child. That's screwed up. I'm not going to get into a no true Scotsman argument here about Christians wouldn't do that, because the reality is people that consider themselves Christians, and I'm not one to judge that. It's not my place. But Christians do disgusting things like this all the time. How someone can consider themselves a remotely moral human being while making threats to a 12-year-old child is beyond me. There's another situation which also inspired, because like I said in the description, there's a couple of situations that have happened recently. But before I get into that, let me just say, at his desire, Telltale was able to move to New York. He's out of the situation. His daughter is out of the situation. That's good. I feel bad. I would have liked to have done this sooner to raise awareness about the situation, what was still going on. My medical problems are why. I will also say, if anyone who watches this knows Telltale, or if Telltale happens to see this, which I think is unlikely, he has a far bigger channel than I do. I live in northern Jersey. I have friends in New York. If there's anything he needs that I can help with, my email is in the description. Please feel free to reach out. I'll be happy to do whatever I can. And realize I'm a devout Christian. I will never apologize for the fact I'm a devout Christian, nor should I. But I stand on your side with this, because it's what's morally right. Hi, Teresa Hall. Teresa Hall says, "Hey, how are you? I've been having a bunch of medical issues, but I'm doing okay." But Teresa comments, "Been watching Telltale a long time. I was upset by all the things done to him and his daughter. It's absolutely immoral and disgusting." And it's not the only example. There's an instance where a pagan woman who worked at Panera Bread had her hours severely cut, shifts canceled. Why? Because when her bosses asked her about her religious beliefs, she was honest and told them that she was a pagan. To the best of my knowledge, and I haven't followed the case in a while, this is not a corporate thing. This is not something Panera Bread as a whole is doing. It was local managers basically harassed this woman for her religious beliefs. On top of that, there's another horrible instance in Texas where a 10-year-old transgender child, I don't remember which gender they identified with, so I'm going to simply go with they, went and testified before Texas legislature about a bill that they were trying to pass to restrict medical treatment for transgender individuals. To basically let the state decide with transgender minors about whether or not they could, Lisa for truth, get puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy and things of that nature. In response to this 10-year-old having the courage to stand up and testify before a state legislature, they received death threats. Again, how anyone can call themselves a moral human being and make death threats of a child. Not a teenage, neither Kylie from Telltale's case, nor this 10-year-old transgender child. That's even a teenager. They're children, for God's sakes. How can you make, even if you think they're wrong, even if you think the teacher is entitled to preach her religion on the job, and make no mistake, that's what she did. Even if you think that's acceptable, it is never, under any circumstances, acceptable to threaten the life of a child. This should be obvious. I should not need to say this. These people need psychiatric treatment at the very least. Or maybe just lock them in a nice little padded room. Serenity brings up a good point, because when you convince yourself the other person is Satan, anything is fair game. Never underestimate humans' ability to rationalize their behavior. You have a point, but there's a verse in the Bible that I think applies here. And let me look it up so I get the right verse, which is Ephesians 6:12, which says, For we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. We are not, as Christians, and for that matter, as moral human beings, we're not supposed to be hating people we see as immoral. That isn't to say that people who commit crimes shouldn't be punished, or people who do moral things shouldn't face consequences. Justice is a thing, but justice should be tempered with mercy. But the real enemy, the thing that, even if you don't believe in spirits, because I know Lisa and others that listen to this are atheists. If you don't believe in spirits, the real enemy isn't people. It's ideas. People deserve respect. People always, humans deserve basic dignity and respect. Even the stupid ones. And yes, Lisa, you're absolutely right. A lot of Christians don't read the Bible. They just get told what it says. But all humans deserve a basic level of dignity and respect. Even people we put in prison, we should not torture them. We should not subject them to solitary confinement, which is a whole other discussion. And for that matter, we shouldn't be practicing, and there are good reasons for this, as much as I think some criminals deserve it. We should not have a death penalty. Not because there aren't Christians, there aren't people that have done something so horrible that they are deserving of death. Because there are people that are deserving of death. But I would rather see one confirmed mass murderer rot in prison for the rest of his days. Or actually, I'll take that back. I'd rather see 100 mass murderers rot in prison for the rest of their lives than see one innocent person be put to death. And there are innocent people on death row. We can be certain of that. Because people on death row get exonerated all the time when new evidence comes out, when people realize the original trial was screwed up, when DNA evidence comes out. Somebody asked me once, but putting them in prison You can't take back 20 years of somebody's life and you throw them in prison. You know what? They're right. You can't take back 20 years of somebody's life if you throw them in prison. On the other hand, you can let them. There's a famous case I've talked about on the channel in the past called the Oak Hill ritual abuse case, where 2 innocent people were sentenced to 48 years in prison based on the sexual abuse of minors that never happened. And they spent decades in prison before it was realized the whole thing was a gigantic mistake. And those people were released and given $3.4 million in a settlement for wrongful conviction. It's a cold comfort if you execute somebody and then are giving their wife or their mother or their children a settlement for the fact that, oops, we killed the wrong person. I'm not saying there aren't times where the death penalty might be justifiable. But if the evidence isn't like, if we don't have body cam footage of the cops finding a killer standing over a dead body drenched in blood, yeah, I'd rather we not killed them. And even in some of the times when they were drenched in blood, I'm not sure I'd want them killed just because mental health issues are a thing. But that's a different discussion and getting me off topic. Because again, the thing I want to talk about here is the reality of a concept that people forget. That particularly a number of right-wing Christians forget. Which is absolutely, Teresa. But this concept is separation of church and state. If you go back and read what the founding fathers, Christians will often say, there was never an intention for there to be a separation of church and state. They just didn't want the government interfering with the practice of religion. And that's not true. That's verifiably not true. There's a book I've been reading about this, and I'm forgetting the name, but there's a good book I've been reading about this that points this out. And it points this out by quoting Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and John Adams and other founding fathers. That they absolutely, positively, they wanted to keep the religion out of the government and the government out of religion. They didn't want to. They absolutely did not want to ban religion. That is not an idea. Lisa, I find that statement debatable because it's a common idea now that most of the founding fathers were deists. A lot of them, a surprisingly high number of them were deists. A number of them were also quite devoutly religious. In fact, there were a few that were religious ministers and things of that nature as well. But the thing is, even the ones who were devoutly religious were very clear about the importance of this idea of separation of church and state. I don't think, aside from the fact I'm not sure I agree that most of them were deists concept, it doesn't matter because the theists wanted this too. And it's an important concept. Through it, in my, there are a number of ideas that were put in place by the U.S. Constitution that are very important. But we were one of the, if not the first countries, to institute this idea of specifically of freedom of religion. And it was a radical idea at the time. People get this wrong too. Because they think, the U.S. was founded on freedom of religion. Or on the freedom to practice Christian religion. It really wasn't. The people that whenever you think of, people came here fleeing religious persecution, certainly it happened. The Quakers were not having a pleasant time in Europe, and they were actually fairly tolerant. But on the other hand, the ones that everybody thinks of as the Christians that came over here and founded the United States, people think of the Puritans and the Pilgrims. What actually happened there isn't what people think it was. It isn't even what I was told growing up. when the pure pilgrims came over here, hold on. They didn't. Yeah. When the pilgrims came to the United States, they weren't fleeing religious persecution in England. They had been persecuted for their beliefs in England. This is absolutely true. But they didn't flee England and come right to the United States. They fled England and went to Holland. Holland was actually it was a Christian nation. It was very tolerant of other people's religious perspectives. Amazingly so for its time. It was tolerance, not acceptance, because tolerance is you can have your religion. We in power give you permission to practice your beliefs, as opposed to just do whatever what the U.S. is supposed to be, which is all beliefs are valid. Everyone gets to practice. Nobody has the authority to tell. You don't need permission to have your religious beliefs. Holland was very much we give you permission, but they actually did follow through with that. The pilgrims left Holland not because they were being persecuted. They weren't. Holland tolerated their beliefs like it tolerated everybody else's. They couldn't accept that tolerance. They fled not so that they could have religious freedom, but so that they could have a theocratic rule. And Puritans, Pilgrims, they threw people out in prison. They even killed people, not for being pagan. Well, obviously, and certainly the Puritans are famous for having killed a whole bunch of people because they were devil worshippers. And that, of course, would be the Salem witch trials. But they also they also punished people for being the wrong kind of Christian. They were neither the Pilgrims nor the Puritans were at all tolerant, for example, of the Quakers. I mean, I don't know how much other people know about Quakers. I don't know much about them, but I know a bit because I grew up in Pennsylvania, which of course was founded by the Quakers. But Quakers, like the Amish, which they often get confused for, are nonviolent people. They take an oath. To be a Quaker, you have to consciously object to. You can't enter you don't enter the military. You don't go to war. You don't commit acts of violence. Yes, Lisa. I know there were a few witch trials in the U.S. before the Salem trials. I don't know a whole lot about them, but I do know that they happened. But the colonies did not have this overarching idea of religious tolerance. It was the founding fathers. And this is another thing that's very interesting that people get wrong, because there's this idea that we were founded to be a Christian nation. And if you strip out what the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the various other colonies, and remember there are colonies that didn't come over here for religious reasons. People came over here to escape debts. People came over here for who had been accused of various crimes. People came over here for a lot of different reasons. But when you look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence mentions God 4 times. I want to say, and it doesn't say Jesus. It doesn't say Yahweh. It doesn't say the God of the Bible. It just says God. There is one time that the Declaration of Independence puts a qualifier in the God that it's talking about, instead of just using generic God, which is when it says nature's God, which isn't it's not necessarily a not anti-Christian thought way of putting it, but it's not a particularly Christian notion. But also remember what the Declaration of Independence is. the Declaration was never intended to set up, it did not set up a country. It did not set up law. All it was intended to do was a statement of intent to the British, to King George III, the current King of England, who was a devoutly religious man. Yes, I'm going to get to that too as well, Lisa. You're absolutely right. That the U.S., that we were going to be a new nation of our own. We were not going to answer the crown to the English authority any longer. In that document, yes, they invoked God. They invoked this divine idea that they had authority to do what they're doing. But the way they invoked God is more of a humanist perspective than certainly a Puritan or other Protestant Christian perspective. When you look at the Constitution, which is what actually sets up the first laws of the United States, only mentions religion, never God. Not once does it mention God, but it mentions religion twice. Once we all know, which is that the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to freedom of religion. The other time, which is not one of them amendments, it's actually within the content of the Constitution itself. I don't remember where. Somebody else can look it up if they like. But it explicitly says that the United States cannot have a religious test to hold public office. For example, this would mean that you cannot disqualify someone for running for president for being an atheist or a Catholic or a Mormon or a Muslim. You cannot connect someone's ability to hold political office in the United States to their religious beliefs or lack thereof. There are states that do this. Texas, parts of Texas in particular, actually require in the law, in the written laws, you have to be religious. But that is a direct violation of the U.S. Constitution, and it is unambiguously so. There's no point in the Constitution. The Constitution says you cannot do that, and people do it anyway. Another excellent point that Lisa brought up, which I was going to mention, one of the other things people look at is the Pledge of Allegiance and the money and the whole one nation under God. So let me read something to you. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What I just read was written by a socialist minister by the name of Francis Bellamy in 1892. It was published in the Youth's Companion in September of 1892. Bellamy had hoped the pledge would be used by citizens in any country, not just the United States, by the way. This is where we get the Pledge of Allegiance from. In 1923, it was altered. The 1923 version reads, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You notice something missing from both of these versions? In 1954, in response to the Cold War and the communist threat, President Eisenhower would encourage Congress to change the pledge again. To be clear, Bellamy's daughter, who was still alive at the time, explicitly objected to the alteration. That alteration is, of course, what we know now, which is I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But it was not meant to include the words under God. Money, for that matter, historically has not always said, in God we trust. What's on money is based on the U.S. seal. The original intended by the founding fathers motto of the United States was not in God we trust. It was e pluribus unum, out of many one. which makes vastly more sense when you think about the nature of the United States, in my opinion. Because as my fiance, Serenity has put it in the past, the United States is less one country and more like 50 different countries that are under a loose alliance and confederation. Which culturally and legally, when you think about it, yeah, there are a lot of differences between individual states. The founding fathers understood a fundamental truth that any student of history also realizes. Religion and government don't mix. State religions don't work. They wind up trampling people's freedoms, no matter how well-intended they are. Nor does restricting what people believe work. And you can look throughout history to find examples of this. And here's another problem with the entire idea of an official state religion or restricting religious freedom. You run into what's called thought crime, which is you're not punishing people. In generally speaking, when we design laws, we punish people for what they do, not what they think. If somebody sits in their basement or in their mother's basement eating Cheetos and thinking to themselves that somebody should assassinate the president of the United States and how much better we'd all be if cops were shot down and all of that, and all those sorts of radical, violent thoughts, and that person never posts the thoughts on the internet, never publishes a manifesto, and never goes out and actually commits an act of violence, they cannot be punished under the laws. You cannot punish somebody for having an idea, no matter how stupid, evil, or violent the idea is. You punish them for acting on it. And the reality is, okay, you want to enforce Christianity as the state religion of the United States. Two questions. Which form of Christianity? And how do you justify it being that form of Christianity? When you look at the founding fathers, as has been said, how many is a debatable question, but a lot of them were deists. Thomas Jefferson, one of the main drafters of the Declaration, and big part of creating the Constitution, was a deist. He liked the idea of Jesus. He liked Jesus' moral teachings. But there's a famous book called the Jefferson Bible, where he took a set of scissors to the Bible and cut out all the miracles, just leaving the moral teachings, which is what he found value in. Do we go by that version of Christianity? Do we go by the Puritan version, where, let's face it, it still has a huge influence on U.S. culture, and it's not a healthy one? Do we go by Martin Luther's original theses that he nailed to the door of the Catholic Church that are the beginning of Protestantism? Do we go by the Roman Catholic Church's version of Christianity? If we were going to pick a religion to make the dominant religion, if we're going to pick a dominant form of Christianity, by raw numbers, the biggest denomination of Christianity in the United States is Roman Catholicism. That would technically give the Protestant Christians what they say they want, which is a Christian theocracy, and none of them would be happy. You can pick one of the Protestant denominations, and congratulations, letting them pick and choose what sort of religious practices are legal and not. You're probably about to alienate the vast majority of Christians in the United States, because again, by most counts and most standards, the biggest group of Christians in the United States are Catholic. Even more so if you skip the Roman part and consider Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, or Episcopalian. They're a sizable. They're not the same religion, obviously, but Orthodox, Anglican, and Episcopalian and Catholic have far more in common with each other than they do with most forms of Protestantism, and they make up a very large percentage. Do we go with that form of Christianity? Do we go with a Mormon's idea of Christianity? Do we go or Jehovah's Witnesses' idea of Christianity? For that matter, let's give Protestants who think they want a theocracy what they want. We'll take Catholicism out of the equation because they don't believe Catholics are Christians anyway. So what's the biggest religion in the United States if you take Catholicism out of Christianity? Islam. Congratulations, we now enforce Sharia law. Going strictly by the numbers. Nobody wants this. Even people who think they want theocratic rule really don't. Because here's the reality. Let's say we pick the original form of Christianity. I'm putting this in air quotes because that's a huge argument I'm not getting into. But somehow we get a time machine, go back in time, find one of the original 12 apostles, and have him set up a Christian theocracy in 21st century America somehow. And then send him back because he's allowed to do his apostling. Imagine within a week we'll have at least two denominations of Christianity fighting with each other. Christianity was a single unified religion for about the first 1,000 years. There were heresy. I mean, that's an overstatement because the reality is there was Gnostics and other sects that were considered heresy. But the vast majority of Christians, for 1,000 years, pretty much agreed with each other on the major tenets. And then in the 11th century, there were some religious arguments. One of the biggest actually being a question of, could they use unleavened bread as the Eucharist? There were some political arguments. And there was what's called the Great Schism or the East-West Schism, in which Roman Christianity, now known, of course, more popularly known as Roman Catholicism, and Byzantine, better known as Eastern Orthodox Christianity, split from each other. Even within the first couple hundred years of Christianity, they still could, they still were arguing about some details. And within the first 1,000 years, we had two different denominations separated because they couldn't agree on things. And think about that. In the last 1,000 years, how many different denominations of Christianity have appeared? It splits, and it splits, and it splits, and it splits, and it's continuing to split. I mean, you had the Southern Baptists, and then you had the offshoot of them, the International Federation of Baptists, and then there was a whole bunch of problems with them, and you've split off and have the new International Federation of Baptists, and in probably 10 more years, you'll have the improved Federation of Baptists, and it's going to keep going because that's if you get three people, you can't get three people to agree. Let's be honest. Think of two other friends of yours. You all decide you want to go out to eat. How much time are you going to spend arguing about where to go? If you all spur of the moment just happen to meet up and say, hey, let's go do lunch. You think you can get big groups of people to agree? They'll start arguing over some of the denominations have split over some of the silliest things you can think of. Again, it's not the only one, but one of the theological problems that created the first great divide in Christianity was over what sort of bread to use in the Eucharist, for heaven's sakes. You wouldn't think that'd be that big of an issue. Theocratic rule, always, every time in U.S. history, every denomination of Christianity that's tried it turns corrupt. Because here's the reality of the situation. as we've all heard a million times, absolute power corrupts absolutely, or the alternative version of it, which is power draws the corruptible. The more power you put in one place, the more it tends to go to people's heads. Churches wield enormous influence over people's lives. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just a fact. Churches already wield enormous influence over the United States. We're still fighting about teaching science in biology classrooms, even though the question of evolution has been settled for decades because of people's religious beliefs. People are dying. People are being infected with sexually transmitted diseases. Where teenage pregnancy is rampant because schools are still married to this idea of abstinence-only based sexual education, which is not based in science. It's based in a puritanical morality from Protestant Christianity, and it does not work. And what baffles me, what absolutely baffles me, is how much adults how often adults forget what it's like to be a teenager. You were a teenager once. Everyone watching this, if you aren't a teenager now or you aren't younger than a teenager, all the adults watching this, 100% of you were teenagers once. I guarantee you had the same lectures from your parents about sex before marriage. You weren't told, and how it was wrong, and it was an affront to God. How many of you did that actually stop? How many of you were told that masturbation was immoral and sinful, but you did it anyway? I think, if we're being honest, most of us most of us went past what the abstinence-only based education would tell you should do. Or if you didn't, you really wanted to. So all that abstinence-only education actually does is scare kids by giving them inaccurate information about STDs, or STIs, I guess they call them now, and leaves them uninformed, or worse, misinformed about what they can do to cut down on the risk of STIs, to cut down on the risk of teenage pregnancy. Teenage pregnancy is a problem in the United States, not because there are too many condoms, but because we don't tell teenagers how to use them properly. We don't tell teenagers that that if you put the thing on properly, the chances of pregnancy are actually pretty darn low. Like within the 5% range. As long as it's on properly, it doesn't break. I'm not saying I think all teenagers should be having sex. I'm not a proponent of the idea that you have to wait for marriage. Don't get me wrong. I'm a believer in the fact that people should wait to have sex until they are emotionally ready to have sex. When that isn't something I can tell them or anyone else can tell them. That's something they have to decide for themselves. And if they don't do that, it doesn't make them a bad person. It means they may have missed out on a part of the experience they might have enjoyed more if they had. Depending on the circumstances under which it happens, there may eventually be emotional issues if it's and by that I mean if the sex is coercive, for example, they may have emotional issues. I don't mean if they get drunk or if they do some other thing like that. I don't mean that it's going to create emotional issues just because they had sex before marriage. Although it might. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not saying that one way or the other. That's not my point. My point is that there's a point of emotional maturity you should probably reach first. But the person best qualified to tell you if you're at that point is you. And for God's sakes, I would rather hand out 1,000 free condoms than see one more teenage pregnancy. I would rather 1 million kids have protected sex than have one kid wind up with AIDS or another sexually transmitted disease that would have been prevented if they used proper protection. And that is the reality of the world that we live in. But because of the very real influence religion has over government that it should not, we still live in a world where 12-year-olds, like Telltale's daughter, are told how horrible and evil of a person they will be if they ever have sex before they're married. Or if they happen to be within the LGBTQ plus community. I know it's up to IA and more, but I can't remember. Half the time I can't remember them all. I don't mean to exclude anybody, but telling these people that they're bad people is wrong and is doing real damage to our society. As a Christian, I don't have the right to, I'm a big believer that if what you're doing is done with the consent of your partner and within reasonable safety precautions, while unprotected sex is a terrible idea for a lot of reasons. It's your business, not mine. I don't think I'm a big, I consider myself a conservative, but never a Republican. And the reason I consider myself a conservative is I think wherever possible, the government should mind its own business. It's not the government's job, and by that I include the schools. It is not the government's job to tell you when you're ready to have sex or who you're ready to have sex with. It is not the government's job to tell you whether you can be an LGBT individual or not. That's not their business. That's not their place. It's not the place of your teachers. It's who you are is your own decision to make. And nobody else has the right, no one has the right to take that away from you. Least of all the freaking federal government or state governments. There are times, I'm not a pure conservative. I'm not an idiot. There are times when the government should and needs to intervene in people's lives. But it should only interfere when it needs to be done to protect people's rights, not to decide on issues that aren't its business. And people that are consenting and properly consenting, so of appropriate age, not not drugged and things of that nature, all the other things that go into that. But if they are consenting, and it's not in any way coercive, it's not the government's business. It's not my business. It's not the business of anyone who isn't involved. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a lot of fun. This ran longer than I thought I was going to be up to, which I'm very happy about. But I'm going to need to get going. I'm not going to get into specifics, but I will tell you why I need to get going, because it actually does particularly relate to the show. I need to make a phone call. This phone call, and I may be giving out more general information because of the fact that respecting privacy and confidentiality is a big deal. But I'm making a phone call relating to the fact that probably within the next few weeks, I need to make a trip to look into a possible case of a haunting taking place somewhat near my area. Aside from doing a show, basically, I'm going back to what I do. I want to thank you, both Teresa and Lisa, for your kind words about how nice it is to see me again. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you. I'm very glad to see you both. It's been a while. I am planning on being back next week with a new topic. I haven't decided what yet. But the good Lord willing, it is my intention to go back to weekly shows. keep an eye on discussion tab here and also on our page, The Paranormal Encyclopedia on Facebook for updates. That's where I'll usually post things about if I have to take a break, when the show's going to be on. Sometimes I'll even be real generous and tell you what we're going to be talking about on a particular night. But I was more up to this than I thought, which makes me very happy. And I enjoy being here. So I am back, ladies and gentlemen. I am looking into guests. I'm giving thought, but I'm looking at doing the online convention like I talk about sometime in the near future. But that's going to do it for tonight. If you like what I'm doing, if you want to support me, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. If you happen to have a few bucks that are burning a hole in that wallet and you want to help me out, my Patreon is in the description. Any amount is always appreciated. If you have any questions, if you think your house may be haunted, if you need an investigation, or if you have some question you're too embarrassed to ask me in chat, or you think you or someone you know might be a good guest, my email is in the description as well. That's going to do it for tonight. This is Kevin Mears, demonologist in the Paranormal Encyclopedia, saying good night, God bless, and we're back, baby. Good night, everybody.